He was a modest man, the son of a preacher who believed that education was the key to equal opportunity for the races. He joined the Army Air Force at a time when its policies reflected the generally held belief that blacks were incapable of succeeding in technologically complicated jobs. Without fanfare, he proved the bigots wrong.
He fought in 3 wars. He fought in World War II, in Korea, and in Vietnam. He held a number of positions of increasing responsibility in that time period, and his career is really a role model for anybody today who would see themselves serving the United States in the Air Force.
Over the course of his 30-year career, he flew more combat missions than any other pilot and changed the way America thought of its largest minority. He is Charles McGee, and he is a legend of air power. Charles Edward McGee was born in 1919 in Cleveland, Ohio. His father was a Methodist minister. His mother died when he was only a year old. His family moved around the Midwest, his father taking different jobs in and out of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Though his geography might have changed regularly, the love and support of his family did not waver. His father, an educated man, emphasized the importance of learning in his children's lives. The schools McGee attended in Ohio, Illinois, and Iowa were not rigidly segregated, and he enjoyed the same education as the white students. At the height of the Great Depression, McGee graduated from Chicago's DuSable High School. He wanted to go to college, but lacked the money for tuition. He enlisted in the Civilian Conservation Corps, a Depression-era make-work program paving highways across northern Illinois. What he earned, he saved. That same year, 1938, Nazi Germany annexed part of Austria. In Asia, the bulk of China came under Japanese occupation. The War Department in Washington created the Civilian Pilot Training Program, which, despite its name, was to train military pilots on college campuses. When the government published the list of sites, not a single black school made the cut. McGee had by this time enrolled as an engineering student at the University of Illinois, and he met his future wife, Frances Nelson. During the summer, he worked in a steel mill. He was visiting his father in Gary, Indiana, when word came that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. McGee enlisted rather than waiting to be drafted. He decided to be a pilot.
Realized that just from my technical training and what I was in, that there was something inviting about being a pilot, that I said, comparing what might happen if I were drafted, I said, I'll volunteer.
In the spring of 1942, he took the test and underwent the physical. He went back to school and to Frances with no way of knowing whether his enlistment or his draft notice would be processed first. As it turned out, a sympathetic acquaintance at the draft board pushed McGee's draft notice to the bottom of the pile, hoping that he would be admitted to pilot training. He was, and just after marrying Frances, he reported for training at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. His excitement was tempered by hard reality. Tuskegee, for all its promise, was deep in the hostile American South.
I think the first big change came was when on the train you hit a certain point there in southern Illinois that you had to go to a certain section of the train and that would be your seat for the rest of the trip, which didn't include dining car and that type of thing because of the nature segregation. I guess they call that the Mason-Dixon line, and when you cross that line, the rules of the social activity in the South took over.
Tuskegee was an experiment that few in the Army Air Force believed would succeed. That black flight cadets would be subject to the same standards as whites was not a measure of the Air Corps' respect, Many in the Army believed that blacks could not meet the same standard as whites, and that holding them to that standard would prove once and for all their racial inferiority. The young African Americans reporting to Tuskegee believed that to be treated equally, they would have to be better than their white counterparts. The standard for Tuskegee Airmen was perfection. They were to fly by the book, behave as officers and gentlemen, and be above reproach in every aspect of their lives. McGee graduated, but unlike white flyers who went almost immediately overseas to join existing combat units, he and the other black pilots embarked on a seemingly endless round of additional training. Desperate though some units were for personnel, none wanted the black flyers. For months, the training grew more exacting. It was not, however, the white officers who held the black flyers to a higher standard. It was the blacks themselves. In January 1944, McGee boarded a Liberty ship, destination unknown. He landed in Taranto, Italy in February, and then went by truck convoy to a hastily assembled base near Naples. There, the 332nd Fighter Group assigned McGee and the other Tuskegee Airmen P-39 Air Cobras. They spent the next several months in a backwater of the war, flying uneventful coastal patrol. The group moved up to P-47s, a faster and higher flying craft, and transferred from the 12th Tactical Air Force to the 15th Strategic Air Force. The 15th was, in 1944, getting slaughtered over southern Europe. From the Balkan oil fields to the skies over Vienna, its bombers traversed some of the best protected airspace in the world. Desperate for fighter escort, the Army Air Force moved the 332nd North to fly bomber escort. In their aircraft with helmets and oxygen masks, the white bomber crews were at first unaware that the escort was made up of black pilots. But they did see the results of the rigorous training and discipline the Tuskegee Flyers demanded of themselves.
There's some very good descriptions of this, where they were expecting for them to be late because this was supposed to be their first combat mission. On the second of the appointed time, they were there en masse. And he states that they were flying all over the place, above them, intermingling in the formation, flying below them, and then wagging their wings to show that they're there. And then in a second or two, they had taken their positions above and alongside.
The 332nd got P-51 Mustangs after only 6 weeks escorting bombers. The P-51 was the best fighter the United States had to offer. On one of his first missions in a Mustang, flying escort over Vienna, McGee's flight commander dispatched him to ward off a German fighter.
My flight was picked to ward them off, and in that chase, that's where what we call the rat racing begins. You're maneuvering, but you don't think about that then, because somebody might be trying to, and is trying to get on your tail. In getting on this aircraft that we had gone from altitude in a dive down, and we're down almost over the aerodrome when I was able to get a burst into the aircraft and cause him to crash. Those few minutes pass pretty quickly, and it's over with. And we're fortunate to be on the surviving side.
The Red Tails quickly built a reputation as what one historian called the best of shepherds. During what is surely one of the most phenomenal runs in air combat history, not a single bomber under the escort of the 332nd was lost. During that period, when a full tour for a fighter pilot was 50 missions, McGee flew 136. Despite the accomplishments of the Tuskegee Airmen, when the war ended, the Air Force remained segregated. Few assignments were open to African Americans. The inefficiency of segregation was obvious. Black officers with well-developed specialties were not assigned to white units in need of their expertise. That forced McGee, like many others, to learn new skills. Trained in single-engine fighters, he turned to multi-engine flight. The Air Force assigned him to Lockbourne Air Force Base in Ohio as base operations and training officer. He learned instrument flying at Barksdale Air Force Base and completed a demanding 10-month aircraft maintenance technical course. After becoming an independent service in 1947, The Air Force started assigning personnel based on need and expertise rather than race. The integration was not a matter of official policy, but it paved the way for President Harry Truman's formal desegregation of the military in 1948. Trained as a maintenance officer, McGee moved through a series of assignments, each with greater and greater responsibility. In virtually every assignment, he was the first black officer to serve in that office. And in every assignment, he excelled, and the ironies of military life for blacks became more blatant. He was in charge of base shops for the 301st Bomber Wing, part of the elite Strategic Air Command. Though he commanded 60 technicians, white and black, his family could not join him because there was no housing for a black family in the nearby town of Salina, Kansas. That situation repeated itself through the late 40s, with McGee moving to a new assignment full of hope, only to confront the reality of segregated off-base housing. Still, McGee persevered. He kept his cockpit proficiency up, flying C-47s and other multi-engine transports. He succeeded at every job he held, getting all the right ticket punches on his way up the career ladder. In May 1950, the Air Force ordered McGee to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. While awaiting the arrival of his family, the Korean War broke out. The United States was so unprepared, there weren't any modern jets available to fight. The Air Force, which had recently taken McGee off flying status, gave him an F-51, an upgrade of the P-51s he'd flown in World War II, and sent him off to battle. UN forces led by the United States almost lost the Korean War. In the opening weeks, the North Korean army swept southward, pushing a tsunami of refugees and dispirited military personnel ahead of it. The only real defense the Americans could offer was air cover. McGee flew mission after mission, first out of Japan, and then out of a base hastily built within a tiny valley perimeter near Busan, at the far southern tip of the Korean peninsula. This was a very different type of combat, buying time for ground reinforcements to arrive. Instead of fighting above the clouds, McGee strafed and bombed enemy supply lines and troop concentrations.
They're firing on gun emplacements on a hillside that was trying to protect the valley. We had been assigned and picked up our targets, and we're firing our guns and at a gun emplacement, but you see just as many tracers and so on coming back and flying by the aircraft because they're firing away at us. They'd turn those guns away from Army targets and on us as we were coming in, and took a hit out in the wing, and fortunately it was in the wing, because if it had been in the cockpit, I'm not sure I'd be here to talk about it.
In November 1950, still early in the war, the Air Force promoted McGee to major. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for his various actions over Busan. In February 1951, he flew his 100th mission in Korea. After 2 long combat tours and 2 separate wars, few would have blamed McGee if he had relaxed to rest on his laurels. But after more than a decade flying propeller craft, McGee instead learned to fly jets. Reassigned to the Philippines, he flew symbolically important missions over Formosa, illustrating the American commitment to a free Taiwan.
I'd never flown a jet, which was a real thrill to be in command of a fighter squadron, to get into an aircraft that was a real joy to fly because there was no torque with the engines, jet engine operation. You had no torque that the propellers give you, and to go to 100%, check everything in the green, and just go fly was indeed a thrill.
The war ended in 1953. The Air Force ordered McGee to Command and General Staff Schools at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. The assignment was in many ways affirmation of a career officer's contribution and potential. But the American South continued to pose problems for black flyers.
Suddenly the white barber realized that I was Negro, and he didn't cut Negro hair. And asked me what my nationality was, and I told him, and he didn't cut my hair. he had started, but he didn't finish. And we had to work with the base commander to get at least a barber shop on the base that would cut Negro hair.
McGee considered leaving the Air Force. He thought of Francis and their children and the effect the relocations and reassignments had on them. All around him, experienced pilots were opting out, leaving the Air Force for higher-paying jobs, flying for the airlines.
I was ready for the airlines, but they weren't ready because it wasn't until in the mid-'60s before, after a couple of lawsuits, that they began to hire.
To keep flying, McGee had to stay in the Air Force. Things could not have worked out better if he had planned them. The prize for a career officer is command. Though blacks had made tremendous progress in the Air Force, command was not open to them. No black officer had ever commanded a domestic air wing. Still, compared to the rest of the country, the Air Force was a model of equal opportunity.
In a situation where you are forced to be together, you learn to live with each other. You not only learn to live with each other, but you learn to respect the capabilities of each person there.
The type of stoic patience McGee exhibited lost popular favor in the 1960s, when civil rights became one of the most divisive issues in American history. But consider the courage it took McGee to persevere. With no guarantee of success, he excelled. With no sign of an open door, he kept knocking.
It didn't deter me from continuing on the trend that I've established or that I was doing. And it wasn't something being done to say, well, now if you do this and this and this, you're going to arrive at some place. It was just a way of life that I developed to treat others as I wanted to be treated, and hopefully that respect would come in time.
As the Air Force modernized, McGee modernized with it. As a pilot, he trained and checked out in the F-89 Scorpion. And as a maintenance officer, he managed a staff that kept aircraft running and ready to take off 24 hours a day. In 1955, he took a job responsible not just for airplanes, but for missiles as well. Without fuss, he'd made the transition from biplanes to the space age, all in a country that seemed at times openly hostile to his ascendancy. In 1956, the glass ceiling broke. The Air Force promoted another Tuskegee Airman, Daniel Chappie James, to commander of Otis Air Force Base outside Boston. James's breakthrough would have meant little had there not been qualified, arguably overqualified, black officers waiting patiently in the wings. McGee was certainly one of those. In 1959, he was promoted to the regular U.S. Air Force. He had been technically a member of the Air Force Reserve. Becoming a member of the regular Air Force was a necessary step to further promotion. He deployed back to Italy, along with the Jupiter missile, commanding the small cadre of Americans who helped the Italians man the missiles. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he and his family were in Minot, North Dakota, on the front lines of the Strategic Nuclear Force. In the aftermath of the crisis, he transferred back to 10th Air Force Headquarters in Kansas City to help revamp strategies and operations to better suit the modern world. When Latin America was a hotbed of Cold War intrigue, McGee worked as Chief of Joint Plans and Operations for the Air Force's Latin American mission. Through all of this, he kept flying. While he could easily have become purely a desk officer, he thought of himself first and foremost as a pilot. In 1966, he set out to learn an entirely new kind of mission, air reconnaissance. In 1967, at the age of 48, McGee went to Vietnam. The assignment made his wife mad. How much blood do they want, she asked, distraught that her husband was about to leave for a third combat tour in a third war. McGee, however, didn't waver. His country called, and he answered.
I became the commander of the 16th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron and took that squadron to Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Vietnam.
There were, however, major differences between what he had done before and what he was doing now. The RF-4C used for reconnaissance carried no weapons. The only defense they had was speed and the skill of their pilot. Ton Son Air Base was, at the peak of the Vietnam War, one of the busiest military bases in the world. Fighters roared out over the war 24 hours a day, their missions determined by intelligence gathered by McGee and a handful of other reconnaissance pilots. McGee flew primarily over northern South Vietnam, venturing into Laos occasionally to document troop movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The mission started out high, beyond the reach of anti-aircraft guns, but McGee eventually had to dip down low, flying a careful grid while his backseat operations officer snapped photographs. Flying over Laos, McGee's Phantom took heavy fire and could not make it back to Ton Son Nhut. He calmly diverted to Da Nang, landed safely, removed his film from the unflyable craft, and hopped a transport to Ton Son Nhut. The most vicious fighting of the war came in 1968 during the Tet Offensive. The Communists launched a coordinated attack all over South Vietnam. Attacks near Saigon sealed Ton Son Nhut off, and McGee was one of only 6 reconnaissance pilots available to fly a huge roster of critical missions. Unfazed, recalling his experience in the crunch of Korea, he organized his squadron to manage all the missions necessary in the first 3 panicky days of fighting. When he finally got a chance to sleep, he slept with his helmet on because the base was under almost constant mortar attack. In May 1968, McGee flew his 172nd and final combat mission in Vietnam. He didn't know it at the time, but he had flown more combat missions in 3 wars than any other pilot. 409. For his work in Vietnam, the Air Force awarded him the Legion of Merit. After nearly 3 decades of struggle, McGee achieved what had long before been impossible. He was the first African American in command of a domestic air wing, a man in the full of his career. After the nomadic life of a career military officer, he was stationed in the closest thing his family had to a hometown, and he was in command.
Looking back on the career, can see that progress and the change, so it gives you a good feeling that what you aspired and held out there as a target was still slowly becoming a possibility, that you were treated based on your ability and so on and not color.
McGee retired in 1973 after 30 years, 6,300 flight hours, 409 combat missions. He had been awarded a Legion of Merit with 1 Oak Leaf Cluster, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 Oak Leaf Cluster, and high decorations from the governments of Korea and Greece.